This episode was proudly sponsored by Neller Insurance Agency and Elise Harney Real Estate. We want to welcome you to Main Street Moxie. I'm Thorne Christiansdottir.
And I'm Mary O'Neill.
Today, we're diving into the first Moxie by Proxy, and that's a segment where we look to a historian or writer to cast light on the Moxie of a historical figure. And today's Moxie by Proxy person is Pete Vermilyea.
So Pete Vermilyea is a history teacher at Housatonic Valley Regional High School and the University of Connecticut. He's the author of 2 books on Litchfield County history and is currently working on a study of Connecticut and the coming of the Civil War. I've worked with Pete, and his love of history and his belief that it's critical to do history and not just read about it are evident in every class that he teaches. He is so enthusiastic about history, which is completely infectious. And you'll hear that today as he talks about our Moxie by Proxy subject, Eleanor Roosevelt.
And for more information about Eleanor Roosevelt or Pete Vermilyea and anything we mentioned, go to our website, www.mainstreetmoxie.press, and check out the show notes. Mary, I'm so excited to introduce our first sponsor, and that's the Neller Insurance Agency, who insure your entire world.
With 3 offices in Chatham, Copake, and Vallecia, New York, they are here to help you with any of your insurance needs, whether it's home, auto, business, health, farm, or life insurance. Their insurance services reach across multiple states: New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, South Carolina, Florida, New Mexico, and Wyoming.
And they insure our entire world right here. But you know what? They insure this podcast. They insure my house. They insure basically everything, from my health insurance, my jewelry, my car, my kids.
Well, Thorne, since I've known you, they've always been the person that you go to for expert advice in insurance.
They are. If there's a question or if I have another need that pops up, like when we started this podcast, I call Kirk up and I say, Kirk, what do I need to do? And he went through, well, Thorne, you're going to need this and we can do it this way or that way. So he really insure my entire world.
Well, it sounds like my kind of insurance agency.
Mm-hmm.
They are the Neller Insurance Agency, and they are here to insure your world. To learn more, visit them online at www.nellerins.com or call them at 518-392-9311, and you'll always get a human on the other end.
Elise Harney Real Estate is the #1 real estate agency for the tri-state region, providing a comprehensive overview of the entire regional market spanning Litchfield, Dutchess, Columbia, and Berkshire counties.
They proudly serve over 40 unique communities with over 33 years of experience. Whether you're searching for the perfect new home, land to build, a rental property, or a luxury estate, they are the community connection in the tri-state region of Northwest Connecticut, the Hudson Valley of New York, and the Berkshires of Western Massachusetts.
And you know what? They've proudly served us too, because our awesome office space right here on Main Street is thanks to Elise Harney Morris.
Well, my exposure to Elise Harney Real Estate is through their constant sponsorship of community events and nonprofits in the area. Having raised my kids here, they were always willing to lend a hand or support some kind of event at the school or in the community.
They always go above and beyond.
Truly above and beyond. So when it comes to your next real estate adventure, let the Elise Harney Real Estate team help guide you. Visit www.harneyrealestate.com or call 860-435-2200. So hi, Pete. Welcome. We're happy to have you here today.
Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, Pete Vermilyea is a history teacher at Housatonic Valley Regional High School, and we have deputized him today for this Moxie by Proxy episode where we talk about a historical figure that demonstrated Moxie. And Pete is, I'll call him an expert on Eleanor Roosevelt, which he might dispute, but he's an expert to us. And so we're going to talk about Eleanor's own brand of Moxie. So to start Pete off, we're going to ask him what he thinks Moxie is and how Eleanor might have had Moxie herself or displayed characteristics of Moxie.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks again for having me. This is a lot of fun. And I guess I would define Moxie as guts, as courage, especially in the sense of doing something that might not be socially normal, sort of outside the mainstream. And I think, I don't know that I'm an expert on Eleanor Roosevelt, but I think I do know a lot about local history. And she jumps out at us, as a Dutchess County resident, as someone with strong ties to the area. But I'm not sure that there's many people to me, historically better exemplify Moxie than Eleanor Roosevelt in her willingness over a long life to continually stand up for the underprivileged, for the underrepresented, to use her social status at a later time, her own family wealth, and in a later time her political influence, to do what she thought was right for people, even at the risk of her own standing.
Because some of the things she did wasn't very popular.
No, some of the things she did were not very popular. Some of the things she did were way out of the mainstream for the time period.
Yeah.
And when we can talk about those more specifically if you want, but I'll just for now say it's also one thing I appreciate about her Moxie is her relentlessness. So there was a story that she would flood Franklin Roosevelt's inbox on his desk with memo after memo after memo. This needs to be done. That needs to be done. And he finally put a limit on it and said, "You're allowed one memo a day, Eleanor."
So he for his time and she for hers, he allowed her to cultivate that Moxie. I mean, he engaged with her romantically. They got married. They were a partnership in a lot of different ways as the years went on. I just feel for that time period, and maybe you can speak to that, how novel that was between a man and a woman in a relationship, let alone president and first lady.
Yeah, and he has a really interesting way. There's clearly a romantic element to their relationship at the beginning. And then things happen in their marriage where that relationship becomes more of a partnership. And he had a way of recognizing her role, recognizing her contributions. But he was also fully aware that what she was doing wasn't necessarily very popular. And he would make a joke of it, right? So he allowed it. And he acted on it. He needed her. We'll get into that in a second, I suppose. But he would also say publicly, well, I can't control my missus. Or I could run the country, or I could control my missus, but I can't do both, right? And that's sort of a little bit of a throwaway line, a little bit of a joke.
Right.
That's acknowledging both aspects of it. That she was a dynamic crusader in a time when that's not what people were looking for in the First Lady.
In that article that you assigned to us as homework, which we
teacher,
both did.
What did you think was going to happen?
I know, but the biography by David Michaelis talks about how she rewrote the rule book for the First Lady.
She absolutely rewrote the rule book. The First Lady was a hostess. And there's some First Ladies who had some political influence over their husbands. We know that Mary Todd Lincoln certainly did. We know that Edith Roosevelt certainly did. And there's others. But the general role was that of White House hostess. Rutherford B. Hayes' wife, Lucy, was famous as Lemonade Lucy because she refused to serve alcohol in the White House. And when James Buchanan, the only bachelor president, was elected, this was a big question. Who will be the White House hostess? And he had a niece, and she did it. But that was the role, right? That was the role. And then, but Eleanor had been a serious political player for a decade or more before she became the First Lady, right? So she begins sort of her work as a social reformer in settlement houses in the city as a young wife. This would have been 1905, 1906. A Sunday school teacher working in the settlement houses. And then by the 20s, Roosevelt in 1920, Franklin Roosevelt in 1920, 1921 is struck down with polio. And if he's going to remain a player in the Democratic Party, it's going to be because Eleanor keeps his name alive, even to the point of getting involved in unusual ways with her own family, in the sense that Eleanor Roosevelt was the niece of Theodore Roosevelt. There's a story. Her father was Theodore Roosevelt's brother. Her father was Elliot Roosevelt, and he died when Eleanor was young. And in 1905, when Eleanor and Franklin married, Theodore Roosevelt was the president. And she asked Uncle Theodore to give her away. It was at this occasion that Theodore Roosevelt's daughter Alice said, "My father needs to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral." And so he walks her down the aisle, and there at the altar is Franklin Roosevelt, and he slaps Franklin Roosevelt on the back, and he says, "Well, Roosevelt, there's nothing like keeping the name in the family," right? Because Eleanor Roosevelt's maiden name was Roosevelt. So, but Theodore Roosevelt's son, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., was her cousin, ran for governor of New York as a Republican. And Eleanor knew that there was basically room enough in New York State for one Roosevelt in politics, and it couldn't be her cousin Elliot. So she did something extraordinary. This was in the 20s, maybe 1922. She got a car, and she could drive her car. And I'll tell a story later about that I love so much, because we want to talk about Moxie. We'll talk about her driving a car. She got a car. She got like a paper mache or a cardboard oil derrick and put it on top of her car. And she drove all over New York State with this, campaigning against her cousin, Elliot Roosevelt, for governor of New York, because he had to lose for Franklin to have a political career. Now, the oil derrick was a nod to the scandal in the Harding administration about the, what do you call it, federal lands were being leased to oil companies illegally, right? So this was the scandal of the time. And she was going to connect him to that because she knew how unpopular it was.
Were they two different parties?
Yeah, because so there's two branches of the Roosevelt family. There's the Oyster Bay Roosevelts, that's
right.
Teddy, and then there's the Hyde Park Roosevelts, and that's Franklin. And Teddy and Franklin are fifth cousin. And the Oyster Bay Teddy Roosevelts are Republicans.
Okay.
And the Hyde Park Franklin Roosevelts are Democrats.
So it's interesting. You know, she starts out volunteering, working in these settlement houses, very local in New York. I'm interested in how she also sees the local, but then is able to visualize scaling her efforts to at the end, the Declaration on Human Rights, completely international. Right. What does it take to have that kind of imagination?
It's really interesting in the sense that she never loses sight of the local. So for her entire life, she's keenly interested in education, which in her day was there was no federal Department of Education, right? Education was a local matter. And I think that she saw the local governments, the local community as the incubator of a democratic society. You know, she says that much when she comes to Housatonic in 1949, 1958, in the midst of the Cold War. It's at the local level that students learn the attributes that allow them to be citizens in a democracy. And I don't think she ever forgot that. I mean, it takes different meaning to her at different stages in her life. But I think to answer your question, I think there's a lot of things going on. And first and foremost, we're talking about an incredibly intelligent person. We're also talking about somebody who has a very steep learning curve, but also a willingness, when we want to talk about Moxie, it's a willingness to change. It's a willingness, or let me just actually modify that a little bit. It's an ability to change. Because I'm sure that the willingness was always there. She was not happy about Franklin's election in the sense that she did not want to be First Lady for a number of reasons, but she thought First Lady was a ceremonial position, as we talked, a hostess.
Right.
And that it would, in essence, Franklin's appearance on the national scene as president would put an end to her own career, to her own influence, to her own political life.
So she didn't see that as an opportunity?
She did not see it as an opportunity. She thought, she saw it. She was depressed about it. She thought it was the end of her as an independent force.
Wow.
But of course, she modified that.
Right.
And a big part of it connects back to Franklin's polio, especially because what Franklin Roosevelt is doing as president in its own way is so different than what anybody else had done, right? So she's redefining what the role of the First Lady is. He's redefining not just what the role of the president is, but what's the entire role of the federal government and its involvement in people's lives and right through the New Deal. And it's on a scale that's so unprecedented that this is playing out all over the country in these little communities and these big cities. The amount of federal spending, the amount of federal building and projects, etc. And the first one of the major roles that she's going to take right away is, it's extremely difficult for Franklin Roosevelt to travel. Extremely difficult. Now, he travels all the time, but he travels between Washington and Hyde Park, where he can be accommodated, where his disability can be hidden. It's very difficult for him to get out and travel around the country. That's what she does for him, right? She becomes his eyes and ears. She goes all over the country.
I think I read the quote, she was his eyes, ears, and legs.
Eyes, ears, and legs,
Yeah.
right? She becomes his legs. I mean, there's remarkable video of her going into coal mines, of her traversing these, for lack of a better word, these like zip lines across these industrial parks. And it's remarkable stuff to think that she's doing this.
How did that not be the role of the vice president? How did that come to her?
Roosevelt's own vice president. I'm going to clean this up for our audience.
Okay, because I know nothing about it. So
Roosevelt's
Make a
own
mess, then
vice
clean it up.
president was a man named John Nance Garner. And John Nance Garner had been a major player. He'd been the Speaker of the House. Becomes Roosevelt's vice president. He sort of assumes Roosevelt will serve his term and then I'll succeed him, not having any idea about what's coming. But John Nance Garner says the vice presidency is not worth a bucket of warm horse spit. It was a nothing job. Theodore Roosevelt had been vice president. And when Theodore Roosevelt was elected vice president and sworn in, he resumed his study of the law. He said, my political career is, I don't want to say it's over, but it's at least on hold for some time. What am I going to do? There's nothing for me to do. It's a different age.
So at a time when Franklin is redefining the presidency and Eleanor is redefining First Lady, the vice president position does not have the same transformation.
No. The vice president served primarily two functions. One, of course, was to be at the ready, just in case. And the other was to be the president of the Senate and to break ties in the Senate and to preside over the Senate on rare occasions. But when Roosevelt is elected, the Democratic majorities are so enormous. There's not going to be ties in the Senate. I mean,
Right.
it's a position of nothing to do. You're not really going to see a modern vice presidency until maybe Carter Mondale. And even that doesn't look like what you would see today.
Right.
So, plus Roosevelt doesn't know John Nance Garner. I mean, have they met? Yeah, but doesn't know him, doesn't trust him. Politically, Roosevelt is a liberal Northerner. Garner is a conservative Southerner. Right? He's not going to send Garner out to do this. He's going to send somebody he trusts. Right? It's going to be Eleanor. It's going to be his aide, Harry Hopkins. These are the people who are going to go out and do this kind of work and report to him. What are things really like out there? What do people need? How are our programs working? Right? So that's sort of the role that allows her to get out there nationally.
Right.
And that's kind of unique also to do for sending a woman on the 20s,
Absolutely.
30s, 40s.
Absolutely.
So what was the reception and sorry to,
No, go
jump
ahead.
over our questions. What was the kind of the reception that she had to of course her Moxie had to come into play that
Sure.
there's never been anyone in this role.
And so the response is mixed. There's wonderful, wonderful video footage of the people embracing her. But in certain circles, she's wildly unpopular. That being said, for a lot of people understood her empathy. They understood her compassion. And they wrote to her. So the Roosevelts, the amount of mail they received just simply dwarfed the amount of mail that any president had received. And we're not so far from the Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, where you can go and you can look at these letters, and you can see these letters. In fact, they have a wonderful display right when you walk in of letters written to the presidents and to the First Lady saying, "My children don't have any clothes. I imagine you have a closet full of dresses. And I wonder if you can help. But I don't think you write that letter unless you think she might help.
Right. How did they get the impression that she was that compassionate? And is it from meeting her on the road or word of mouth?
Certainly for some, they met her on the road. There's word of mouth. But Eleanor also is a very effective practitioner of the media of the day. Especially, so she in her lifetime, she wrote 27 books.
Wow.
But what she did that's truly remarkable is that she wrote a daily newspaper column called My Day every day for decades.
Wow.
Decades. Thousands and thousands and thousands of these articles about what she did that day. Sort of a public diary, right? But she's shrewd enough politically to write how is what she doing on that day tying into broader issues.
Right.
So I think people are getting a sense.
So it's an inside look, behind the scenes type of thing.
But a sense of the compassion that's there, a sense that this is a different player on the American political scene.
So because of that, she was more approachable. Just like today, we feel like we know celebrities and whatnot because we have social media and we quote unquote see them. So
I think that's an excellent word, that they felt that she was more approachable.
I think she's understood the value of connection. In that article, again, it talked about her childhood, feeling isolated, lost, alone, alienated due to the early death of her parents, being foisted to other family members, and that she has this empathy for that feeling and can recognize it in others. And then those pivotal years in her life, and maybe you can talk to that, where she goes to boarding school, Allenwood in England, and meets Madame Silvestri. Can you talk about those years?
Sure, but if maybe we'll just take a little bit of a step back first. She's born to a wealthy family. She's going to marry into a wealthy family. But she understands suffering because she suffered herself. Her parents suffered. She didn't have her mother died when she was very young. She didn't have a great relationship with her mother. She adored her father. Eleanor Roosevelt, by all accounts, was a loving, charismatic person who was also a serious alcoholic. He had brought great scandal on the family. I'm not sure that Eleanor at her young age understood that, but she loved her father, and he died as well when she was young. She understood suffering. She lived with her grandmother for a while, her mother's mother, Grandmother Hall. And she spent some time, vacations, holidays, with Theodore's family, which had to be a very difficult thing because that we're talking about unusual, unprecedented, right? That family at the time, they were ultra competitive, they were athletic, they were rambunctious, and it wasn't who she was. And so I think that, there was a family love there, but not exactly a place that she fit in. And then she ends up at this boarding school in the London suburbs, in the Wimbledon suburb of London. And that's where she finds a place where she fits. That's where she finds the headmistress who becomes a real motherly figure to her. It's where she finds a love of learning. And I think it could probably safely be said that, it's the place that she knew she was loved. It's a place that she knew people believed in her. And it goes a long way towards shaping who she becomes.
I think also I got the impression from things that I've read that this headmistress empowered her to believe that she could actually affect change.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what an extraordinary gift that is. As a teacher yourself, what an extraordinary gift if you can do that for a student.
Right, and I think the part here that's maybe a little bit unusual is Eleanor's born in the 1880s into a world where there are models of women who are advocates for change and social reform. This Jane Addams with the Hull House and the settlement movement, and certainly Susan B. Anthony and Lucretia Mott and the suffrage movement, and someone like a Carrie Nation. But Eleanor's not of that class, right? She's of a different class, a class that really believes in Victorian values and a belief that people of her class are supposed to act that way. There's a wonderful biography of Franklin called A Traitor to His Class. And I don't know that we would call Eleanor, and it has to do, right, with his policies, etc. And I don't know that we would call Eleanor that, but she certainly defies the expectations of her class. And she gets the spark at the school, right, that she can be a force for change, that she can have a life of action. And boy, she certainly carries that out.
Yeah, it's just incredible to think of, as you said before, the relentlessness and just consistency, but also a vision of something larger, just to keep widening the circle. And I'm just struck by that just in my own life, like how do I scale this? How do I take something to the next level? And I don't know whether she just had an intuition about that or whether she even thought about it. It was just like, well, this is what you do.
Right.
And then there's a quote that she used from that article that she used to say in a situation, what can be done? And what an open question. I mean, as a teacher, you know how you phrase something carries a lot of power as to what kind of response you're going to get.
Absolutely.
And I wonder if you can talk about optimism combined with pragmatism.
Yeah. I think as a speaker, she became more effective over her life, became more inspirational. I think her pen was always inspirational. I think the important thing here is to understand part of what makes her successful at it, part of what makes her so inspiring to people is that she lived it too, right? Mm-hmm. She didn't just say, you know what you people should do. Right. She did it herself. And she did it on a day-to-day level, mm-hmm. and she did it at an extraordinary level. So when she came to, I love this story so much, when she came to Housatonic, and I don't remember if it was her 49 visit or 58 visit. But first of all, she was invited to come in 1940. I love this part. She was invited to come speak at Housatonic by the principal, Paul Stoddard, whom she had met on a trip to the Soviet Union. So just picture that. This is the First Lady of the United States. I believe it was in the 30s, and she went to the Soviet Union. But she met Stoddard, and Stoddard invited her to come to Housatonic in 1945, and she wrote back and said she couldn't because of the gas rationing. She couldn't get the gas to drive from Hyde Park to Falls Village. She's the First Lady of the United States. Of course she could have gotten the gas, but she's going to live that, right? Right. She's not going to tell other people, here's what you need to do, rationing, etc., if she's not going to do it herself. So I like that. But when she comes in 1949, and it may have been 58, she drives herself from Hyde Park to Falls Village. First she went to Litchfield, right around the corner from my house. Her cousin lived there. She went to her cousin's house in Litchfield, then she drove over to Falls Village. Stoddard arranged for a police escort to meet her at the Connecticut border. The Connecticut State Police would escort her, but he didn't tell Eleanor Roosevelt that she was going to have a police escort. So she comes over the border in her car, and the Roosevelts were horrible drivers. She comes over the border in her car, and all these police pull out, and she thinks she's being pulled over. Oh. So she pulls over to the side of the road, right? So here is a woman in her 60s or 70s who's the former First Lady of the United States and has significant family wealth, but who drives herself around. That's living it, right? Yeah. In the 50s, she went to Tennessee on a civil rights mission. And the Ku Klux Klan told her if she came to Tennessee, she was going to be killed. And she insisted. And the police said to her, this is what we're going to do. We're going to drive the car right up to the plane. We'll escort you down the steps of the plane, right into the car. Bulletproof vehicle, we'll assume, etc., etc. And she said, absolutely not. I am walking across the tarmac, and I'm carrying my own bag. In the face of these death threats, they found bombs in the wheel well of her car on an occasion.
Oh, my goodness.
Right? But she insisted that she was going to fight that fight.
Well, that takes some moxie.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
I'd say.
Seriously. Doesn't it? I mean, you can find the picture so powerful of this woman. She may be at that point about 70, carrying her own bag across an airport runway, knowing that her life is in danger.
I feel like that's a good place to wrap up with Eleanor. But I want to ask you, as a history teacher, one of the reasons we went down this road of Moxie by Proxy was because we thought there were historical figures. And having had the privilege of observing you teach and seeing the products and the artifacts that come out of your classroom, I feel like you to talk a bit about your pedagogy regarding history and what you're hoping to accomplish with students when they leave, when they graduate and move on and maybe never take another history class.
There's a lot there.
Well, we've got time. So.
More than anything, I'm bothered by a society that wants to simplify history, that wants to compact things into acronyms and mnemonic devices. And history is exceedingly complicated. And we're going to, because people are complicated. People are complicated and people are history, and therefore history is going to be complicated. But we need to understand that. Even for our own day-to-day understanding of our world, if we think that there was such a thing as good old days, if we think that our lives today are so complicated and why can't things be easy like they were in the past, we're not doing ourselves a favor if we spread that story, because things were incredibly complicated in history. And I think that the better our students can understand that, the better they can understand their own world. But I also want my students to understand that there's no, what's the word I'm looking for here, sort of magic key to history. History's not written by or created by some secret society of people, right? That they fully have the ability to tell, to add to our understanding of history, to contribute to our knowledge, right? And it's especially true at the local level, that our students are fully capable of digging into materials in a way that other people could, but in terms of access, the students are here, the local history is here, and we can really get a good understanding of our national story by understanding our local story first. Eleanor thought everything started locally, and I think that that's true of students. It's true of adults too. I've done hundreds of public programs around history over the last 7 years or so, and one of my big takeaways is this: not everybody likes history, but most people like local history, and students can understand the broader national story better if they understand the local story.
Do they often make that connection?
Yeah, I think so. I think they do. That's what happened in Sharon is just like. So the Great Awakening was George Whitefield was speaking on the Sharon Green, so he really must have been going all over the country. That kind of stuff. Yeah. So I want my students to be practitioners of history, not just students of history. I want them to think deeply and critically about the past and its relevance to today. The classic question the history teacher gets is, when are we ever going to need this? You're going to need it every day of your life. You may not need the dates, right? The dates aren't important. The chronology is important. The cause and effect is really important. But
I was in some museum in Sweden a couple of years ago. It was a historical museum, and there was an exhibit about trying to explore the artifacts that they have in storage, and that even what is presented in the museums is a reflection of those who choose it. So we might go through the same storage room filled with artifacts, and you might pick something, and I might pick something completely different, and Thorin might pick something completely different. And I'm wondering if you have any perspective, in your teaching of history, of how it's curated and what lenses to use and how to introduce different lenses.
I chuckled a little bit when you started to say that, because we had this exact discussion yesterday in class. So
it's pretty relevant, Mary.
Oh,
it's pretty relevant. I have my students currently making museum exhibit posters about World War I. And they've got dozens and dozens of, we'll put it in quotes, artifacts to put. And they were saying, I don't see how I can possibly fit all of these. Well, you're not going to fit all of them. You've got to choose. You've got to choose which ones best tell the story. Well, how do I know which ones are right?
And whose story?
They're right to you. You're the storyteller. Right? We need to understand, too often we associate the word bias with being a negative term. Right? I think that's absurd. The important thing about bias in history is to recognize that it's always going to be there. Who's the storyteller? And who are they telling the story to? Right? So if we understand that, every museum there is has about, I don't know, 10% of its artifacts on display and 90% of them in storage. And, people are making the decision about what to display and why to display it. But it's a personal choice.
Do you think that there's more reflection about what comes out given the cultural moment that we're in, that people are reflecting more about what comes out and that more aware of the bias that they carry with them? And that has to change how the story is told, if people are aware of that bias that they carry with
Absolutely. Them. And I think you see it all over the country if you look at the public programming that's going on around history museums. And the walking tours, the exhibits are dealing with topics that they've never dealt with before. And, it's not an easy endeavor for those organizations to do, because that's often not the strong part of their collection.
Right.
Right? So, if you go back and look at the origin of historical societies, for example, you begin to see a lot of historical societies popping up in the 1850s, I assume, as the people realize that the revolutionary generation is gone and trying to preserve something of their legacy. But they tend to be an upper middle class, educated white crowd that's organizing these efforts, that's undertaking the collection drives. And I think that's only started to change in recent decades. Every historical society or history museum will tell you that the weakest part of their collection by far is post-1950, in the sense that people don't think that's history.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and so, but it also really affects the stories that they're telling. Right. But they're making tremendous efforts and doing great work.
I see that too. Work. I see that too, just as a museum goer, the changing perspectives and the real attempts to let other voices be heard and explore the same artifact or exhibit from different angles.
Yeah, I think there's also really, and I think we see this in education as well, the realization that you don't always need the, quote, real thing, right? So if we think back decades ago to what history museums looked like, you had the notion of the historic house museum, and we're going to recreate, you name it, John Hancock's house, and it's going to be exactly as it was. But we've seen a shift from that, right? Mary, you and I took students to the Tenement Museum, and they don't necessarily even pretend that anything there is real. It's just representative.
Right.
It's about feel, right? It's about feel. And we talk a lot about with students is, could we capture the feel? What did it feel like to live in the past? What was the daily life of people like, as opposed to the sheer facts of a president's life?
Well, I think that approach, just to wrap up and pull back to Eleanor Roosevelt, that she believed in humans reaching out for connection, that human connection, she lived human connection, maybe because she was denied it for a while in her early years, but I think having that history come alive through the eyes of another person, that you feel that, oh my gosh, they felt the same insecurities or were dealing with the same types of struggles.
I think your word connection is so important, because more than anything, I think a teacher wants to create a lifelong learner in their students. And I'm not sure to what extent historical facts are going to create lifelong learners, but I feel that you've got a better chance of doing it if you can establish a connection. And just to talk about the Roosevelts for one last time, more about Franklin than about Eleanor, but in terms of connection, there's two things that always grab my students. And in pre-COVID days, we'd go every year to the Roosevelt Library, where they do amazing work. And two things always grab their attention. The first is that all throughout the house, they have these things on the wall that look like light bulbs, but they're not light bulbs. They're just hanging on the wall. And they're fire extinguishers, an early fire extinguisher.
Oh.
So Franklin Roosevelt's son said his father was only afraid of one thing in his life, and that was fire, because of his disability.
Right.
That he would have the family practice fire drills, and that he would have to crawl down the hall into the service elevator and lower himself in the service elevator, etc.
Wow.
But these, you would grab these light bulb looking things and throw them on the fire, and the glass would break and the chemical would come out and it would snuff the oxygen out and put the fire out. Forms a connection with students in the same regard that Franklin Roosevelt, for about 4 years at Hyde Park, worked with crutches to walk to the end of his driveway. Every day he was there, he worked to get to the end of his driveway. Now, their driveway was a quarter mile long, but he worked every day to get to the end of his driveway because he knew that if he couldn't do that, he could never have a political career again.
Right.
Right? And so you stand there at the end of that driveway with students and you think about that and it affects them, and all you really want to do is get them to want to learn more.
Is it because it humanizes the subject?
Absolutely.
And that's what helps the connection?
Yeah. I think that the humanizing it absolutely makes that connection.
Because when you were telling that story, I was envisioning myself in his shoes, having to crawl afraid of a fire. And so that made me think of him in a more approachable way rather than a president that you can never see, touch.
That's right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Well,
That's
Pete,
powerful.
we are happy that we connected with you today.
Me too. This is
and
fun.
Sharing the story. We hope you'll come back again.
Anytime.
Thanks
with
so much,
another
Pete.
historical Moxie figure. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Moxie by Proxy is important because we can learn from the past, from the people who have gone before us. And we deputize a person who is knowledgeable about someone like Eleanor Roosevelt. And today that was Peter Vermilyea. And the stories that he shared about Eleanor were incredibly inspiring. And I think we can learn a lot from her brand of Moxie. What did you think, Thorin?
Well, I thought we were just doing Moxie by Proxy because of alliteration.
All right, well, that too.
All right.
But
I see a T-shirt.
Exactly. But back to Eleanor.
All right. Well, I mean, I have a degree in history. I love history. So, having someone like Pete who has expertise, beyond the average person is just a great outlet, I think, for us and for our listeners to get to know someone, quote unquote, who we've read about or maybe, we've visited, where FDR and Eleanor lived. And so you experience it differently in getting to know the inside and outs of someone who knows them more intimately or of their story, to be more accurate, I think gives us a little extra additive. Plus, we're talking about Moxie. We have to look at what's come before us, and that kind of goes to the notion of history that we learn from what has happened before. And for me personally, that's why I loved studying history, because I wanted to understand how it is we went from there to here. And my biggest takeaway in our conversation with Pete about Eleanor Roosevelt was when she became First Lady, how she felt that position was going to hinder her. That just blew my mind. Because now you think, oh my God, that's one of the most powerful positions in the world, to be the First Lady or be in that position that would open so many doors for you. But she viewed it in the opposite way. But to flip that, what did she do? With her Moxie, she changed that role forever. For everyone who's come after her. It went from being the organizer of dinner to making a difference, and we can, rattle off all the things that she did with that position. But to me, that was, of course, given her childhood and upbringing and, just being able to become someone of substance after having lived through that. Yeah, of course, and having her husband disabled and, losing her parents. Like, we can't, not give, knowledge or acknowledge that, with how much Moxie that requires. But to me, it just blew my mind that this major position of power and importance and positioning and being such an icon in that role as First Lady, how she viewed it. But then Eleanor being Eleanor, she made that something brand new.
Yeah. And her, as Pete was talking about her use of the media and how many decades she produced a column about her day that really humanized her and the president and bridged her life to the life of the constituents in the country. I thought that was incredible, her use of the media for good. And I also thought that her emphasis on the local.
For sure.
And doing. And what was the question that she would always ask that we talked about?
What can be done?
What can be done?
I love that, because let's get some shit done.
Yeah, totally. That is just alone as a worldview, instead of looking around and being cynical and depressed about the state of affairs you see around you, but just what can be done. And she was helping in settlement houses and in soup kitchens when, for her class, that was not done.
No. You kind of just bridged the gap for me. This is our third interview. We had Kirk Neller, We've had Sarah Taft-Jones, and now talking with Pete about Eleanor. All of them who we have dubbed have Moxie and why we love talking to them, they're all doers.
Yeah.
So Eleanor definitely falls into that. And I think, using her quote, what can be done?
It's a great takeaway.
Well, let's see what our listeners think. Maybe they'll leave us some comments on Facebook and on what?
Instagram.
Because we're not on TikTok yet.
Yeah, not yet.
We'll talk about that.
All right.
Until next time.
Bye.
This episode was proudly sponsored by Neller Insurance Agency and Elise Harney Real Estate.